Hello, I am Deb Coviello, the Drop-In CEO, and as always, I am grateful that you've dropped in this week and listened to our show because week after week, I have the great honor of speaking to amazing leaders who share their insights and inspiration with you. And we do this podcast because we sincerely care about that leader, partnering with them to help them navigate challenges and opportunities with confidence. And it is my honor this week to introduce to you Dr. Sirisha Kuchimanchi, who is a TEDx speaker, author, semiconductor tech executive, entrepreneur, podcast host, board member, and investor. And she is the founder of Sahita Technologies, which specializes in consulting services that encompass semiconductors, advanced manufacturing, and workforce development. She has a PhD from Carnegie Mellon University, is an IEEE senior member, and and she is an IEEE senior member and co-chaired her company's. Okay, we're going to restart the bio. Liz, forgive me. I'm just going to restart her bio. And I am pleased to bring onto the show Dr. Sirisha Kuchimanchi, who is a TEDx speaker, author, semiconductor tech executive, entrepreneur, podcast host, board member, and investor. She is the founder of Sahita Technologies, which specializes in consulting services that encompass semiconductors, advanced manufacturing, and workforce development. She has her PhD from Carnegie Mellon University, is an IEEE senior member, and co-chaired her company's Manufacturing Women's ERG, which supported over 500 employees across 3 continents and 8 countries. She's hosted the podcast Women, Career, and Life, a top 30% on Spotify, and listened to all over the world. And we are going to have so many amazing stories to share with you. But Sirisha, I am so happy to have you onto the show.
Thank you, Deb. I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
So, to my listeners, the reason why I invited Sirisha to the show was I was reaching out to CEOs, founders, presidents, people in the manufacturing space. And when we got on our discovery call, we immediately vibed off each other. We have so many similar experiences, but she has an amazing backstory. And so I think her story, her journey is going to be truly inspiring. And then we're going to go deep into what she does and how she helps organizations and people. So I'm going to hand the mic over to you to share a bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having this conversation, because we all have different stories and it's important to share them, because many of us might wonder how to navigate some spaces, and I think it always helps to find clarity through other people's journeys. So I'm originally from India, came to the US for graduate school, so I went to Carnegie Mellon, and I worked for a year at a company, and it was a downturn at that point. So, I got laid off less than a year after starting work. And I find this to be a sort of a pivotal moment in my career journey. Not when I was experiencing it. I can say in all honesty, at that point, it wasn't such a great pivotal moment. It is when I look back, I realize it did have a huge impact. And so I obviously had to look for jobs. I was also as an international status, having visa and all of these other complications. So I ended up getting a call from my client that I was working with to come and work for them. So and that really helped. And I didn't have the vocabulary about networking and all of that, but I think that's kind of what worked out in that instance. And so I worked at the client side and eventually transitioned into that company. I worked at TI for Texas Instruments for a long time. Many people may know about it, about TI itself. So I worked there in engineering for a few years. And after a few years, I had actually taken a break from my PhD when I had started work. So I had this itch to go back and complete it. My son was about 2. I was expecting my second kid, working full time and taking a couple of classes at university. So obviously there's quite a bit on my plate. And I decided I was going to take a break from work. So I transitioned into being a stay-at-home mom and finished my PhD while I was a stay-at-home mom. And it was one of the best periods, not just for my education, but just having to spend and making that decision. And it was a personal decision. I know people are in different circumstances, and having that access and opportunity is not always the same. So having made that decision, the reason I find it was not just, of course, spending time with my kids, but I also got to make friends, a different group of friends outside of work itself. And those are the friends I've had for the last close to 2 decades. And we still continue to hang out. Our kids have, sort of grown up in the same vicinity. And so when I was thinking of going back to work, again, the downturn had hit. This was 2008. And I'd actually gone to a job fair to the same location I got my first gig. And there were very few jobs. There were like 10 jobs and 1,000 people or something. So I decided to take another year break and not look for work. And so I was a stay-at-home for about 3 years. And then when I decided to again come back and look for work, a year later, I was looking for opportunities when I got a call back through a friend of mine from my old company asking me if I wanted to come back to work. And so I interviewed and went back to actually my old group, which was phenomenal to transition. So the transition was much easier. I knew a lot of the people and some of the work as well. And what I didn't share the story for a long time with anyone because, it didn't seem that important. But what I realized over time is even at work or outside of it, that people don't realize that they might, if they want to and if they have the opportunity or it's a thought about how you can transition in and out of work and that you can still come back and that network kind of can enable you. And it's not like I consciously created this network or something. It just sort of organically happened. And I think it's how you perform, what sort of legacy you've left for yourself when you leave that kind of triggers that conversation. So I worked for about 13 years in corporate, growing into different roles, growing into leadership roles, and left it about a year and a half ago. And during that time in corporate, I hosted a podcast for about 3 years. It's currently on hiatus, but I did it, and it was primarily targeted towards talking. It was called Women, Career, and Life. And the intent was to enable and help women to navigate corporate life and think about financial independence. For me, intrinsically, career and finances are tied, or even whether you have a career or not, that women have to think about finances and being financially independent. It's not that you don't do it as a family, but it's being aware of your financial situation. So, if circumstances were suddenly to have changed quickly, you're not caught off guard. And because that becomes very, very hard. And so I've switched now into an entrepreneurial journey. So I've done different things, and it's been quite a different change from exiting corporate. And it's still a learning process from time to time. And it's been great finding my footing here.
And such an inspiring story. I could go in so many directions from there, but thank you for sharing all of that because there's a few things in here that I really like. And the same thing happened to me. I was in a startup company and I was about 5 months pregnant at the time. This is my third child. And circumstances were that they let me go. Now they let me go with some good options. I had the opportunity to stay home. I actually thought I was going to stay home and take a break. Finances were not so that I could take an extended break, but it's one of those things that then I had the opportunity to go back into the workforce after 9 months and go into a completely different industry. And, one of the things you talked about was then while you took these times off, and they're wonderful, whether it's to reconnect with the family, special projects, find your people, there's so many advantages of having an opportunity to take a break, was it wasn't necessarily a negative. You had friends, you had a network, and you went back in. And it's inspiring because there is so much narrative out there, which may be true, but it didn't seem to impact you when it came to it's a disadvantage to take time off, care for family members, and try to get back into the workforce. I'm sure it wasn't easy, but we own it and to find a way back in. And I think you've done exactly that, finding your time away and finding your way back in.
Absolutely. And you're right. The narrative can be different. There is sometimes a disadvantage or a perceived disadvantage. Getting back in and getting back on your feet can be challenging. I do not want to negate any of that. Because when you transition back to work, obviously now a lot of it might be a bit of a blur for me. But trying to figure out, when you have young kids or other responsibilities. It does not have to be family, it could be many other things. Navigating work hours, schedules are all very hard to do. It definitely behooves having a conversation with your manager and your boss and seeing if there's something you can work out. At least it's worth a conversation, and then for you to make a choice and decision on how you want to navigate that. Because there were conversations I had internally as well. And of course, it changed over time. It's not a static. And the reason, and for me, the reason I say those were pivotal points is I felt like it de-risked who I became later on, because I felt more confident when people ask me, how did you leave corporate? In my mind, it's like sort of my third exit from where I was, because I've done it before. And I'm like, well, also, I also felt like it changed my risk tolerance. I became more risk tolerant, that I was more, how do I say this? More intentional and more interested. I don't want to use the word aggressive. It's not aggressive. I was more intentional about how I wanted to navigate my career back in corporate. I think if I had not taken those breaks, of course, the first one wasn't really a choice, but I feel like I would have kind of stuck with the status quo. I would not have moved and navigated my career path because I wouldn't have known any different. Just me as personality. I don't know if the others feel the same way. I would not have asked for what I wanted or been more vocal about it, because I felt like, okay, this you already kind of exited. You know how the other side looks, and then you might have options. And I sometimes see this when I have conversations with friends and colleagues who've been at a place a long time. Stepping out can be quite hard when you've spent a lot of time, because all your networks are inside, and so were mine. Mine were networks were all inside the company, but for me, it turned out to be a good thing in the end.
So I'm smiling here and I'm writing down the name of somebody I've already interviewed onto the show, and her name is Shelby Waku, who also she's of the same mindset. She's also worked in tech, and she wrote a book about self-advocacy. And it's knowing what your value is, and reframing the narrative and being able to advocate for yourselves. Because if you're a leader, other people are watching you. And if you can advocate for yourself, your value and what you want, which is exactly what you do, others are going to watch you and learn from you and not be subject to a narrative or victim mentality. So I am definitely going to put you in touch with her. I think she will be a wonderful addition to your network. Um, yeah, I mean, so much has resonated with you, and I appreciate. I think something I haven't even talked about on the podcast that much is you have the time to cultivate friends, because I know from you, like, and myself, you can get quite busy with career, education, and children and lose yourself. And so just finding friends sets you up for success for the future. So, and you look really happy because you have that strong network.
Absolutely. And also, even it took almost a decade, and I find this might happen with many people, is even my childhood friends, probably, and also technology has evolved over this time, right? How we keep in touch. We kept in touch, but when the kids were young, it was very hard. And then over time, it's become much more closer and closer knit, that you catch up with old friends. Of course, COVID definitely accelerated that, sort of the one positive outcome of it. And friends, in the sense, obviously I had friends at work, but this is sort of a different dynamic outside of work, and keeping in touch with this. And interestingly, all of us were stay-at-home moms, and pretty much every one of us has transitioned into work over time and done different things. And so that itself has been a journey to have for all of us. And we meet as whatever, girls' night out and other things, just sort of investing in ourselves. I think that we started early on. It was very hard to navigate when the kids were young, figuring that out. But over time, everyone's used to the idea of doing this. So it's
And I,
not something that has a lot of thought behind it. We just do it.
yeah, and I appreciate this because, it's funny, whenever I show up on these podcasts, we talk so much about, the technical part of your career and your thought leadership. But I think when we bring to forth the personal side of business, the personal side of who we are, that just builds better trust for those people out there, just to get to know you a little bit more, and we can swap stories, because it's not easy, but it's the life we choose, and I wouldn't have changed anything. But at this point, I would love to shine a light on the work that you do in Sahita Technologies. So tell me a little bit more about the value that you provide, and who do you interact with in the problems you solve?
Absolutely. So I work on essentially four different verticals. So one of the ones I work on is around smart and advanced manufacturing, for companies that are in that journey on how to look at this manufacturing landscape, how they're looking. It's essentially a strategy consulting that I'm looking at. I'm looking at a holistic picture and saying, how are you looking at operations? How are you integrating quality, systems you might have in place? It might be even looking at teams in place and how you have all of this structured. The other part of it is around more focused on semiconductor. So I spent 20 years at TI working, in this sphere. So it's focused more on the sort of the technology, the engineering, the quality, just same things, but a little bit more focused around semi. About I also teach like classes and curriculum around understanding this ecosystem, about the different pieces of that ecosystem. So that is something I do as well. And work with clients who are, because there's a lot of changes in this industry. There's been a rejuvenation, a lot of investment. So it could be national or international clients who are looking at, either companies are transitioning, companies are starting, and they're looking at all the different spheres of investment, like holistically, as sort of an ecosystem advisor. That's how I would look at it. So I advise on different parts of their semi-business as they're looking at what the transition looks like, or they're trying to grow or develop a team or develop a certain transition into a new site, something like that. So it works in that space. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so tell me more though then about, because if there's somebody out there or somebody that knows somebody, tell me more about who is the kind of person that you connect with or reaches out to you that says, let's have a conversation. And then what are the challenges that they're experiencing? Because I want to know what that introduction is and the kind of company that would pull you in. Just tell me more about that.
So some of the companies could be, maybe look at like a sort of a mid-sized company that has some technology, but they're looking at, because even companies are in different stages of journey, right? You look at some companies have, they're very at the cutting edge, some are in different stages, and we need all these different products and all these different technologies to work together to, even drive a smartphone or this conversation on a laptop. So it could be that they are earlier in that journey of operations or somewhere there, and they're looking at what all systems do we need, what kind of structure do we need. Maybe they are transitioning into an automotive customer base because there are more stringent quality requirements around that. Having those conversations, maybe they're having a quality or a yield challenge, and they're trying to understand how to solve it. And it's not that my way of thinking is usually not just solving that one single thing, but taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture. So that's why I call it strategy consulting. So look at the bigger picture and say, where is in that journey you're going from point A to point Z? It's not that I want to just solve this. Where does the journey take you? And let's look at what the steps we need to take there. You may not be able to do all of it. Maybe you're not interested in it. You're not investing in all of it. But oftentimes it can happen that we solve this one problem, but it doesn't integrate into the next piece of solution. So we've kind of invested and poured money. So we are stuck with what we've got. And I'm not a big fan of that. And even when I worked, over time, and we had issues or challenges, it was about creating systems and processes that were scalable. And the way I like to look at it is, I don't need to, it should be sort of people agnostic. The system should work, and it's not through human glue, so that the person can step out and the thing still works. It could be automated, it's clearly been transferred. So when some of the work I did is, we would develop a solution and we would fan it out to different sites so that they could use it. And all the data integration, the way we looked at data was consistent, because when you're making decisions, either at the engineering or the upper management level, you need to trust your data. Otherwise, you're making the wrong decision.
Yep.
So it's about finding that right information to integrate. So these are kind of the things. And I also work on the people side, because I used to lead teams and grow those teams, but also helping people get promoted and investing in them, because that is important. And essentially, I've talked myself out of a job in one of my last ones. And I like the fact that I did, when people ask me about that, because I want the process to run largely in many ways, and for people to feel empowered so that they can make some decisions. So they don't always have to come to the manager to ask questions, but they have responsibility as well. And they come up with brilliant
Mm.
ideas that you have never thought of. So I think that freedom of space and ideas is very important for us to drive innovation.
So I really appreciate your approach. And I just recently came from a consulting opportunity where their pain point was in the area of quality, and they were starting to have too many defects. And so they wanted me to look at their systems, their programs, their processes, their people, to understand how could we reduce that risk because they were getting ready for growth. Well, I too went in with a holistic approach. How can we automate some of the processes so we weren't so dependent on human capital? But also, how could we assure that as we onboard our people and how they interact with the equipment, how better can we train them, not only for the work that they're doing, but also to be able to move resources because people change, new people are out. You have to be highly flexible. And then what were some of the error proofing or automation that would be needed to set them up and mitigate issues? So I think you and I operate very similarly. Now, the question though is that who is feeling the pain and who would be the one that reaches out to you? Is it a chief technical officer, a CIO? Is it a chief operations? Is it the president or CEO of the company? Who contacts you, or who is your ideal client profile?
Oftentimes, a CTO or a GM, maybe of a site, it could be the CEO. It depends on the size of the company and who I meet at an event. So those are some of the people. Some of the advising I do, like I said, is also around ecosystem. So it could be other bigger firms that are looking for overarching, how do I say, support and guidance on, they're looking at different systems and metrics, because I worked in not just manufacturing, but new products and this thing. So just to say, how does this transition work? Because the industry is fairly complicated, also very technologically, it's very complicated. And manufacturing by itself, just if you look at a semiconductor chip, takes 6 months to process. So you understanding all the different things that can be impactful, not in a negative way, but all the things that are important to consider becomes
Yes.
so critical. So understanding all these, like a tapestry, how everything threads together and who to talk to, how to pull the right people, what metrics should we be looking at, why is this the process to change, all of that. So I look at like holistically the ecosystem, and are we looking at the right places and the right things? Because oftentimes, and this is not just this industry or anything, right? Oftentimes, just as people, we are very siloed in our functionality, and that does not ever work. It always creates problems over time. And you need, when you're solving a problem, not just the deep expertise, but you need people from adjacent fields that you've never thought to work with, because they bring a perspective. Because think about any product, and I'm going to use a general product. I've heard when Alexa and others were designed, or when you look at airplanes and this thing, you have a singular thought and a certain group designing a product. They do not know how it actually interacts with the other person or with the other group or with the common person. Does it recognize different voices, different accents? The airline baggage thing is quite high, so can people reach? So I'm talking about diversity and innovation, but essentially even diversity in solving the problem is not about just demographics, but actually having different, like a design person, a product person, maybe even a supply chain person, because, or a quality person, someone you don't think of. Maybe you need the IT person to come and tell you, hey, this cannot work, but maybe we can solve this problem like this. So pulling those folks together, and to do it in such a way that you optimize everyone's time. I'm not suggesting more meetings as being the right way to solve it, but finding the right thing, and this thing, it'll take some time to flush it out, and then you can kind of chug along and execute on it. So first the strategy becomes very important, then the execution is just as critical.
So this is where your value is. And again, I appreciate you sharing that because you have the technology, the deep experience, but you also have the breadth of understanding that any solution has to be holistic. And so I think that's where the value is. If there's any CTO out there, general manager, somebody that's just going through a growth stage where you just need a trusted partner that's not only going to help you from a technology perspective, but just has the years of experience and perspective on how to bring a holistic approach. If you don't do that, you're going to maybe solve a problem in one place and cause ripple problems in other places. And I know that's part of my brand as well, as I can solve a business problem with any particular leader. But you do this as well, in addition to me, is that I also then work with the leader or sometimes members of their team to help them with their skills, whether it's having critical conversations, how to articulate their message, the risk, their proposal. Sometimes they just don't have those skills. And so fix the problem, but make sure we take care of the people so that they can carry on and execute and sustain the work that you're doing with them. So you're so aligned with my brand. And that's why I'm so
Yeah,
glad we're
this
talking.
definitely there's a long, strong overlap. Even and even from my work, right? Because I worked on quality issues, oftentimes my conversations internally and externally were not just about metrics, but the impact on the products we were building and how it was personal to us, because all semiconductor products end up in stuff we interact with daily, and how that conversation is tied to you're making this that goes into maybe the car that you drive or something. So it's a more personal connection. And you're right, because some of the other verticals that I work on is around leadership and workforce development. So it's sort of tech adjacent, but not technical always, though most of the clients that I work with are from the tech space there as well. So it's doing leadership conversations, high potential, could be the women emerging engineers to senior management or mid-level management, talking about how to navigate corporate, kind of very much similar to how if someone were to listen to the podcast, how do you do, and it's very actionable, because for me, I read a ton of books. I love reading, but I want something that I can actually take an action, even if it's one thing, when I
Okay.
end a conversation. So you're right. Even whether you're doing technology or strategy change, it impacts everybody, and everybody's usually a little antsy around change management. So how do you
Mhm.
do that well? And I think there's a lot of synchronicity in what we are both doing.
So I just noticed something as I'm thinking through like my next question, because again, I want to continue the conversation a little bit more. We just jumped right past being a TEDx speaker and an author. What was your TEDx talk about? I'm just curious. I don't.
My TEDx talk was actually how to talk to kids about money and raising financially smart kids. If you remember, I talked about financial independence and women, and it got me thinking that oftentimes we're having this conversation at 21 and 25, and it's like, how do you suddenly decide that that is, it's, I guess the term now is adulting, and it overwhelms you. So it's like, how can you do little things and sort of make it intrinsically part of what you do with your children to have that? So it's like a 14-minute talk. I would suggest people listen to it. It's through storytelling, and it's quite, sort of an engaging. There's nothing it's not heavy on the finances. It's about storytelling and how you can have this conversation with your niece, your kid, your grandkid, your friends, kid, whoever it is. And, how do you teach them stronger financial habits so they have a better life for themselves?
I may put you in touch with my first cousin. Her name's Robin Silverman. She, all of her work and her books are about how to talk to children about all the different topics in society. And so she might be an interesting person for you. And just you're an author. Again, I didn't check it out before. Your writing. Tell me about your writing.
Yeah, so the first book that I wrote is actually around finances. It's called The 12 Steps to Financial Independence. It's very much the way I tend to think about it. It's a quick 80-page or so read, and each step has like a sort of a story and then actions. So it's almost, think of it like a guidebook and a worksheet. You can go back and all the basics are laid out, from budgeting to mindset to investing. It also talks about wills and trust, finding an advisor, all of these things, even negotiating at work. So it's like the way I wrote the book and the way I envisioned this is I could carry it in my purse, and anytime I had a question, or I put it in, a table somewhere, and every few months, few years, I come back and look at something and tweak it. And it's something that I also need to do because, constantly things are changing and we need to tweak things. So it was meant to, it's not giving investment advice. That's because I'm not a financial advisor, but it's talking about the things we need to think about when we think about money. Because oftentimes money is such an overwhelming conversation for many people. And it sort of generates this, not angst, maybe fear. Lots of different emotions come when we talk about money. So how to look at this and not be overwhelmed with it, making it simple. And my TEDx talk, I talk about what I call money stories, sort of the history of money that comes with, how we are brought up as well. So this is to make it simple so that anyone can do it, no matter whether you're 12 or you're 25 or you're 65, wherever you are, you could still do these things and not say, hey, it's never too early and it's never too late.
So this has been a fast go. I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's my first one. I'm working on my second book, which is actually it's called Corporate GPS. It's about navigating corporate career, and written somewhat on a similar style. It's different pieces, and then has actions you can take. For me, I even my podcast and everything is structured around something you can do at the end of the day, because we have so much time in a day and I want to be able to do something. And it's not about doing more work, it's about making it less work in the end.
I have another person I want to introduce you to who also helps people navigate changes, whether it's within their corporate environment or to transition to entrepreneurship. So, again, maybe an interesting person for your network. But with that, you are such a dynamic person: TEDx, author, entrepreneur, mother, friend, community servant. You're multifaceted. I'm just so grateful to have had this conversation with you and bring you to my audience. But I'm going to give you the floor one last time before we bring this to a close and for people to get a hold of you.
Yeah, I mean, the best way to connect with me is on LinkedIn. For people who are either looking for the various things we talk about, if you're looking for technology, strategy consulting, or something in semiconductors, or you're looking for leadership and workforce. So I work on workforce development strategy, largely on the technology side, which looks at how to enable more people into STEM fields. So I work on the digital side and the actual strategy itself of creating ways to do this and engage folks, and also on driving leadership conversations. So I've done talks at like Toyota and Society of Women Engineers and different places, and engaging with folks. Because often, at least this is what I find, and I don't know if this resonates with everyone, is oftentimes we graduate from school and we're always taught to work hard and be successful, which I'm not saying it's not important. It is, but that is not the end all and be all when you end up at work, whether corporate startup. And it's about how to find what a mix of what you want to do and what the company needs, right? But there's a push and pull in that, and then how to figure out how to advocate for yourself. And it's a very hard journey, because for me, being an immigrant, finding a different culture, trying to figure that out. And I got feedback around this when I was doing this, and that became very critical for the journey. Also, feedback tends to be critical when you receive it, so quite hard to receive it, but it's very important to do that. So any of these verticals, if people are interested, but best is connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'd love to have a conversation.
All right. So, Sirisha, I am so grateful that you have dropped in the show. This is not a one and done. We have got people I want to connect you with and want to see you continue to be successful. So, I just want to say thank you and wish you well and much success.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you for having me on your show and having this conversation and what you're doing as well.